Thanks, President. I echo the words of the senior senator from Texas in support of our men and women who might be home on leave, might have been sent somewhere on active duty, and that I echo her words. That's the least we can do. So I thank the gentlelady from Texas. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business until 7:30 p.m. with senators permitted to speak thereon for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Thanks, President. 10 years ago this month, 10 years ago, actually tomorrow, I believe, the People's Republic of China officially joined the World Trade Organization. American businesses, we were told, would gain new access to Chinese markets through the removal of trade barriers, through increased transparency, through more stringent protection of intellectual property rights. China promised to follow the rule of law, to reform its legal system, and in turn would gain new access to global markets. At the time it joined the World Trade Organization, China made a number of promises. Chinese leaders pledged to reduce trade barriers and open up markets. They promised to increase transparency, protect intellectual property rights, and reform their legal system. Supporters of the People's Republic of China, including a strong majority, unfortunately, of members of this body and a much thinner majority in the House of Representatives. Other supporters of the People's Republic of China were almost all of America's largest corporate CEOs, argue that the WTO membership would bring human rights and freedom and the rule of law to China. 10 years later, we see a very different picture, a picture that a number of members of the House in those days and some members of the Senate and some opponents to allowing China into the World Trade Organization, we have seen something very different. American workers have seen millions of jobs shipped to China. Factories in places like Youngstown and Charleston and Huntington and Dayton have moved to Wuhan and Shenzhen and Xi'an and Shanghai, with final products sold back to the United States. Think about this, Mr. President. The business plan of a number of American corporations is to shut down production in Mansfield, Ohio, and in Zanesville, Ohio, and move that production to Beijing or Xi'an, China, set up companies there, and ship products back to the United States. To my knowledge, never in history has there been a country where such a huge number of companies would set up that business plan. I mean, think about that. Shut down production in the country where you're located, shut down production, laying off workers who have made you a successful company, hurt a community by closing down that plant, doing terrible damage to the schools, to the police departments, to the city services and all that, and move your production to another country because you can work there more cheaply and sell products back to the United States. To my knowledge, never in world, I could be mistaken about this, but nobody's ever shown me otherwise. To my knowledge, never in world history has that been the business plan for so many companies. American manufacturers that stay here have been undermined by a flood of cheap Chinese imports priced artificially low. When a large corporation moves to China, so often that corporation's supply chains, a tool and die shop, a tool and die maker, a machine shop, a small manufacturer that makes components that sells to the larger company, they don't have the wherewithal to follow them to China, so they lose one of their biggest customers. So those American manufacturers that stay here have been then undermined by a flood of cheap Chinese imports priced artificially low. Some of those Chinese imports came from American companies that moved overseas to China. Chinese citizens so often face poor work conditions, continual human rights violations. The country's sole Nobel Peace Prize winner, China's sole Nobel Peace Prize winner, is languishing in prison. The big winner is the multinational corporations here that have outsourced jobs. And the other big winner is the Chinese Communist government and the apparatchiks that they have enriched. Think about that. The big winners in this China trade policy are large American corporations who have outsourced jobs to China, and the Chinese Communist Party, which apparently seem to be their allies in this, and the people in the Chinese Communist Party, the high-ranking apparatchiks that benefit from this. So while American companies that stay here and American workers are following World Trade Organization rules intended to provide a common set of law to ensure a level playing field for global trade, the Chinese are gaming the system. It's clear that China doesn't live up to its promises, doesn't live up to the unrealistic expectations of its supporters. Far from becoming freer, the Chinese people are burdened with limited rights to basic freedoms of speech and religion and assembly. I can't count the number of CEOs that I saw walk the halls. I was in the House of Representatives, Mr. President, that I saw walk the halls of Congress and say, you know, if we pass PNTR, we're going to see freedom. It's going to, all this capitalism in China, all these jobs in China are going to bring freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly in China. No, it's enriched the country of China, to be sure. It's especially, though, enriched the Communist Party, enriched the People's Liberation Army, enriched some of the capitalists in China in this Communist Party system. And it's getting worse, from the harsh crackdown on human rights lawyers and activists after the Arab Spring in the Middle East, to the brutal policies in Tibet that have led to a recent wave of self-immolations. Imagine the depth of feeling and passion and hopelessness and anger at an oppressive government, that people who have such strong feelings would actually set themselves on fire in protest. From the crackdown on human rights lawyers to the brutal policies in Tibet, the Chinese Communist Party shows no sign of easing its grip on the Chinese people. Not only did their membership, their joining the WTO, not bring freedom and democracy to China, didn't bring fair trade either. China's flouted WTO rules. China's gamed the system to its advantage. While China's chosen to comply with some WTO rules, overall, the list of China's WTO violations is a long one. Rampant intellectual property theft, massive subsidies for China's exports, hoarding of rare earths and other raw materials. China's refused to commit to the WTO's agreement on government procurement. I've stood here, as you've seen, Mr. President, in your time in the Senate, I've stood here arguing for Made in America language so that when taxpayer dollars are spent buying products, that those products should be made in America, paid for by U.S. taxpayers. I've heard conservative Washington politicians defending China for all intents and purposes, saying, no, that would create a trade war, even though China won't sign on to an agreement on government procurement, which is exactly what their Made in China policy is all about. These violations not only show China's lack of respect for the rule of law, they also cost American jobs. They also tend to stymie our economic growth. American intellectual property intensive firms alone have lost some $50 billion to IP property, to intellectual property right violations, with those same firms reporting that better enforcement, better intellectual property enforcement could lead to almost 1 million new jobs. Some of the worst hit are companies in my state, struggling to compete against a country that manipulates its currency and subsidizes its manufacturers. Given our companies' well-founded fear of retaliation by Chinese regulators and companies, if they speak up, we in government must give voice to their concern. Let me explore that for a minute. When we have launched, typically a labor union in the U.S. will launch a petition or a trade complaint, if you will, alleging violation by China of trade rules. Often the American company where those workers work are unwilling to join that petition. Why? Because they do business in China, and they know that China will exert some kind, will in some cases exert some kind of revenge, exact some kind of revenge against them. So our companies aren't willing to stand up to the Chinese because they know what the Chinese will do when they're doing business in China. So it's up to us, as those companies' representatives, as those workers' representatives, as those community representatives, to stand up. The most damaging of China's, probably the most damaging of China's violations is its continual manipulation of its currency. By deliberately holding down the value of its currency to boost exports, China's not only violated WTO commitments, they built the largest trading surplus in history to the detriment of U.S. and other leading trading partners. Senate fought back this fall by passing the Currency Exchange Rate Oversight Reform Act, legislation I authored with a bipartisan group of senators, Senator Snowe from Maine, a Republican, Senator Schumer from New York, a Democrat, Senator Graham of South Carolina, a Republican, Senator Sessions of Alabama, a Republican, Senator Stabenow of Michigan, a Democrat, Senator Casey of Pennsylvania, a Democrat, and several others. This bill was the largest bipartisan bill that passed the Senate this year, passed with 63 votes, joined, in fact, by the junior senator from my state, Senator Portman, former trade representative in the Bush administration, voted for this bill. This bill would crack down on China currency manipulation, provide an opportunity for Republicans and Democrats to come together to put American jobs and American workers first. As I said, it represented the largest bipartisan jobs bill passed this session of Congress. Currency manipulation provides an unfair subsidy to Chinese exports of up to 40%. According to some economists, almost all economists agree it's at least 25%. Fred Berkston, an economist, a fairly conservative economist for the Peterson Institute, has asserted that China's intervention in currency markets and other subsidies that they've provided makes up the most, he said, most protectionist policy of any major country since World War II. American politicians and American CEOs are always afraid of standing up to the Chinese. They say, we'll look protectionist, or they'll say, it looks like we're starting a trade war. Well, when Fred Berkston, who is, again, a mainstream economist, when he said what China does is the most protectionist policy that any country's done since World War II, it's time that we stood up and forced them to play fair. That's not a trade war. In fact, the trade wars come from China. China has waged a trade war against the United States of America for 10 years. That's why we've seen our budget deficit grow from barely double figures a decade ago with China to upwards of almost more than $500 million a day in, day out, 7 days a week. Additionally, American manufacturers seeking to sell their products to China, which is our nation's fastest growing export market, are hit with the same percentage in what amounts to an unfair tariff. So here's what happened. If a company in Brunswick, Ohio wants to sell products in China, they are hit with a 25%, maybe larger, currency tax, currency tariff. So their product costs 25% more at least. When a Chinese company wants to sell into Brunswick, Ohio, and product in Brunswick, Ohio, competing with that company, they get a 25% bonus, a 25% advantage. Hardly a way to practice fair trade. A report released this fall estimates our trade deficit with China, exacerbated by China's currency manipulation, has caused the loss of 2.8 million American jobs in the past 10 years, with 2/3 of the lost jobs in the manufacturing industry. The presiding officer, when he goes to Altoona, when he goes to Bethlehem, if he'd come to Dayton or come to Toledo and see the kind of damage that this trade policy has done to American manufacturing. All of our problems in manufacturing, of course, aren't because of our relationship with China and because they've gamed the system, but millions of jobs in this country have had a direct, have been lost, have been undermined because of China's gaming this system. President Bush, first President Bush, said $1 billion trade deficit or surplus is equivalent to 13,000 jobs. So when we have a greater than $200 billion persistent year in, year out trade deficit with China, that means we sell $200 billion worth of goods, fewer goods to them than they sell to us. Just do the math. If it's 13,000 jobs per billion dollar budget deficit, you know what it's doing to us. Addressing currency manipulation through the trade remedies included in our bill with Senator Snowe and Senator Casey and Schumer and Graham and Burr and Graham and Hagan and many others, that legislation would provide relief immediately to American job creators. A report released earlier this year showed that addressing currency manipulation would support the creation and retention of more than 2 million American jobs without requiring any government spending. That's why this is such an important jobs bill, because it's not spending any taxpayer dollars. It's just saying level the playing field for our companies dealing with China and our workers. After years of China gaining the benefits of WTO membership without adhering to its rules, remember they promised they would go under the rule of law 10 years ago this week. when they joined the WTO. But after years of China gaining the membership of WTO membership without adhering to its, gaining the benefit of WTO membership without adhering to its rules, it's time Congress, time the administration act in our nation's interest. The House should pass our bill. The president should bring it up, should pass it, the president should sign it. American workers and American manufacturers can compete with anyone, but they can't compete on a playing field that's far from level as long as we continue to let China do what it wants without repercussions. Over the last 10 years, Mr. President, China sidestepped and reshaped the WTO to benefit China at our expense. That's not competing, that's cheating. We must act now while we still have a chance.